Hello, everybody. So now that we're moving into the incorporation of our particular groups we're going to be examining in this Latinx politics course, taking from Lisa Garcia Bedoya's book, Mexican Americans, Conquest, Migration, and Adaptation. So from here, we're going to be moving to Puerto Ricans, and looking at Central Americans, Dominicanos, Cuban Americans, and their political incorporation, because each distinct group has a very different historical context that they enter into the United States, whether it's via conquest, as in Mexicans and Puerto Ricans, or others through forms of forced migration, and most recently from Central America. We're going to be examining those processes and the way they incorporate into U.S. politics. But one thing I'm thinking about is we're not only examining how um, populations enter the United States and then become Americans via a form of ideals that coincide with the dominant value system of what it means to be American. We know that is contested. That's being contested right now. I keep saying we're living that moment as we've been living previous moments. But Mexicans present not only the most populous population in the United States of all Latinos, but are the first so-called victims of conquest, right? They are the subjects of conquest that we've been learning as we've been moving forward. So 1848 begins to set the legal precedent on how this group is incorporated into U.S. citizenship. We know at the outset, um, things are occurring in the United States, this is the moment prior to the Civil War that kicks off in the 1860s, but bringing us to the present right now. And we know that the current president initiated his campaign with this call. And it's, you know, this form of racialization now is nothing new, right? So I'm not going to read this. This has been well drawn out, but this is the base from which the current president was able to successfully launch his campaign for the president, right? So that says a lot about how racialization and the dehumanization of a population in order to uplift or maintain the superiority of one group, and therefore the definition of being American, what it means. And this day in 2015 was not seen as being racist by most of society. And I knew that moment when this was stated a few years back in 2015, 5 years ago, um, that people wouldn't think that this was racist, right? Because it's so normalized. And this has a long history as we're learning how Latinos, Latinas were incorporated into the US polity. And these ideas predate even the annexation, the conquering of the territories here that we now reside on, which are indigenous, stolen land from the indigenous peoples. But then, Spain and then subsequently Mexico reclaimed this territory up until 1848. So the land has been contested, identities have been contested. So here we are now, 5 years later from the statement. It's working. It's worked to elevate him to the highest office in the land. We know we're at a moment where this is coming again, and this didn't stop, right? So again, that constant dehumanization, the reminders of who is human, who is fully deserving, keeps coming out of the highest levels of office. We have people coming to this country, trying to come in. We're stopping a lot of them, but we're taking people out of the country. You wouldn't believe how bad these people are. So again, to criminalize populations, right, as a whole, these aren't people, these are animals, to say it as explicit as one can. And a lot of what we're doing, again, is to understand how racialization works, but how it works through law and how it works in everyday society, right? This is a link, and this is not. Again, I just want to warn us to not become and fall into the role of this population is just the victim. It's a story about the victim. No, these are stories that are covered over, and we need to diagnose the problem in order to make it better, right? Because we know in this chapter, Lisa Garcia Bedoya shows us the way these populations are incorporated, but yet also how they organize. And not only specifically after World War II, but they have organized even from that moment of conquest in 1848 in California, Texas, New Mexico. We had bands of resistance fighters trying to reclaim this land, but those stories weren't told to us in our U.S. history class, right? So therefore, they're kind of relegated on the outside. Um, but this is where we're at. How did we get here? We need to understand that whole history, but how it's still being reworked, right? So we're even these, and this is not only, these ideas don't even inflect the mind of simply say white Americans or non-Latino Americans. I mean, you have recent immigrants who believe this stuff about themselves, right? Who try to separate themselves from this type of racialization. So therefore, they either they shift to the dominant, move towards whiteness, or as Lisa Garcia Bedoya wrote in the previous book on fluid borders, before this book, she also did a study and taking a psychological concept of stigma. When a group is stigmatized, such as in this way, those populations that are within that group tend to move in. They have two choices, right? One is they move away from that group and say, I'm not bad like them, right? So they'll move towards whiteness, or they'll use it as a catalyst to organize politically, as we have an example, the Chicano movement. Chicano was a pejorative term. Students, such as yourselves, in that moment said no. They said no more. They they staked their claim to that identity. They formed, they mobilized around it, and now we are here learning of them because of their struggle that emerges from students, that is linked to farm workers' struggles, that is linked to access to voting rights, that is linked to questions of land in New Mexico, Reyes Lopez Tijerina, and folks like that you're reading about, right? But we don't hear those stories until now. And if we're thinking of the way that this current president, and just I'm just using that as an example, but it's pretty commonplace for others to deploy this. The whole race of Mexicans here is becoming a useless commodity, becoming cheap, dog cheap. 11 Mexicans, it is stated, have been found along the Nueces in a hung up condition. This is the Galveston, Texas Weekly News in 1855. So what we're thinking about here, a commodity, not even human beings, right? This is post 1848, just a few years later. The land is being conquered and acquired and taken and hung up. That means lynching. So one thing I'm going to present and I'm going to talk more about, I didn't assign the book here, but I really want to highlight the role of lynchings, racial violence targeting specifically Mexican and Mexican Americans. This is an untold story. This is something we don't learn about in our history books. This is something that the consciousness kind of we don't know because it wasn't taught to us. We all learned about the lynchings of African Americans. Well, what historians are acquiring now, and they're telling them as we speak, the numbers of Mexicans and Mexican Americans, Mexican American citizens who were lynched, right? And those run into the thousands. And some scholars like William Kerrigan and Clive Webb, who wrote a book titled The Forgotten Dead, claim that as many Mexican and Mexican Americans were lynched as African Americans. Pretty comparable numbers, and they argue that it is lynchings of Mexican Americans is as central to our experience as it lynchings are to the African American experience. But because when history is not told, we don't know how to respond or to deal with that. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about that because this Mexicans become the template. We spend a lot of time not only because this is historically the first population coming in, but they provide the template on the way that other groups from Latin America are incorporated into the United States. They are racialized as Mexicans. And if those of you who may have experienced this yourselves, being in circles here in our epoch, where if you're not Mexican of a background, ancestry, but you're Mexican, right? Just that form of racialization where this identity is catapulted upon you because you appear to be, you appear to speak the language, and therefore it's a simple identification. And therefore, you fall into that group category. This is another example I just want to share with you. Cordelia Scaife May was a billionaire funder of these groups, FAIR, Numbers USA, Center for Immigration studies. These are all right-wing think tanks that produce and influence policy in Washington, D.C. right now. They have a lot of influence in the White House. And this was written a couple decades ago, but this is a letter she wrote. And she funded a lot of these programs with a lot of her money. When we hear of immigrants, we instinctively think of Mexicans because they are the most numerous and given the greatest press coverage. In truth, we are being invaded on all fronts. And there she goes, right? But it is the Mexican that enters the imaginary when we think of the migrant, and even if it's real or not. So this is where we are. Just to review, race as a political technology, those ideas that we have stratify our society through policy and law, rooted in that first citizenship law, which is the 1790 naturalization law, where specifically it says who can be a citizen, and here it is a free white person. This is the first act, one of the first acts of Congress. Manifest Destiny, right, where Senator John C. Calhoun, this should be reviewed as we're thinking about this, that the Constitution was never to incorporate anybody else in the free white race. And on this, he was correct, adapting a strict reading of the Constitution. So we know after these processes of racialization, we know James K. Polk ran on a campaign when he was elected the president to annex all these territories that we exist on. They were to invade these territories, take them, either purchase them, which they were trying to make offers to buy the land. Mexico was like, wait. I mean, they even sent an emissary to Mexico City to make an offer, like, we want the land here. It's cheaper than a war if we just buy it. That was kind of the deal, the approach that they had. Mexico, of course, was offended by that, said no. And then you have the invasion and the crossing of the Nueces River. And this is where James K. Polk makes his declaration that American blood has been spilled on American soil, kind of building up that propaganda and getting support of the nation to invade all of Mexico and take the territories. So the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, to settle, to ease the peace from that war, brings in one of the rights that you read was granting U.S. citizenship to Mexicans, right? And so, but what this infers, it also gives them property rights, which was Article 10, which was agreed to, and then when it goes to Congress, because it is the Senate who now ratifies those treaties that were established by the two parties, Mexico and the United States. But when it goes to Washington, D.C., the senators didn't like that protection of land for the newly acquired Mexican inhabitants that were to become Americans now, right, here in California, Texas. When we say we didn't cross the border crossed us, that is historically factual, right? Those claims that began in the Chicano movement, or well, have always been, but became more vociferous during the Chicano movement. You hear them today, people still making that claim. So Mexicans are not an immigrant group. Mexicans are a population that were born of conquest. It is historically wrong to say Mexicans are immigrants, right? The fact is they were conquered over and then became U.S. citizens through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But what scholars note, that was in legal theory alone. We know the practice was much different. The practice was their citizenship didn't protect them from this, the hangings, the racial violence, the forms of taking of land, squatting on their land, not obeying any rights that they had because they were seen as racial others. They had the process of racialization, that their level of inferiority had already been produced and their structure in the social racial hierarchy had already been established. And this is central to labor, questions of labor, right? Where are they going to lie on the labor scale? We're in that moment of slavery still. And if you've ever been to Placerville, I'm just going to end on this note. This is in Placerville, California, on your way to Lake Tahoe. Go down. They still call themselves Hangtown, and they still have this dummy up there hanging from a noose. So we'll come back to this, but I just want to talk about that was a practice. So after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, California becomes a state in 1850, New Mexico and Arizona not until 1912. And I will pick it up from here in the second part as we start to move through. for now, just I want you to get through all these readings and really think about deeply how that history is present today. Thanks.